South Korea is disappearing. That is not a metaphor, and it is not clickbait. It is a demographic fact with consequences that are already unfolding in real time. And by the end of this video, you will understand why this is not a story about women refusing to participate in society, but about men quietly walking away from it entirely. What you are about to hear will sound uncomfortable, even provocative, but it explains why the lowest birth rate in the world did not happen by accident, and why the same pattern is now spreading far beyond one country. Stay until the end, because what is happening in South Korea is not isolated, it is a preview. South Korea today has the lowest birth rate on Earth, sitting at roughly 0.748 as of 2024, which translates to fewer than 5 births per 1,000 people, a number so low that it barely registers as population replacement at all. This is not a slow decline. It is a demographic collapse happening at a speed modern societies are not built to survive. Entire schools are closing, military readiness is shrinking, tax bases are eroding, and the future workforce is evaporating before it even has a chance to exist. And yet, when people talk about this crisis, they almost always point the finger in the wrong direction, blaming women for refusing marriage or motherhood, or pointing to cultural pressures, long work hours, or housing prices, all of which are real, but none of which explain the full picture. What they miss is the central driver of this collapse, which is not female withdrawal, but male disengagement. South Korean men are not protesting in the streets, they are not rioting, and they are not loudly demanding change. Instead, they are doing something far more destabilizing. They are refusing to participate. They are opting out of dating, marriage, family formation, and even broader social involvement beyond the bare minimum required to survive. They are working just enough to live, saving for themselves, investing in their own pleasure, peace, and security, and consciously disengaging from any vision of a shared future with women or with the nation itself. This is not apathy. It is a deliberate response shaped by years of social conflict and policy decisions, and it is reshaping the country from the inside out. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the concept that many South Korean men openly describe as fighting magic with magic. For years, feminist movements in South Korea framed men as systemic oppressors, as threats, as barriers to progress, and as sources of harm that needed to be regulated, restrained, and punished. Men were told that their behavior was dangerous, that their presence was unwanted, and that equality required strict rules and enforcement. Instead of resisting these claims directly, many men chose a different path. They agreed. And then they followed those rules to the letter with ruthless consistency. When women said that men were harassing them by asking them out, men supported laws that limited how many times a man could express romantic interest, even if that interest was as mild as asking a coworker to get coffee. If a man asked more than 3 times, it could be treated as harassment regardless of intent. Romantic interest did not have to be proven. Men accepted this framework fully, understanding that it meant the end of playful pursuit, ambiguity, and traditional courtship. What surprised many feminist groups was that men did not complain afterward. They simply stopped asking women out altogether. When women argued that men were not treating them fairly in the workplace and were gatekeeping opportunities, men agreed again. But this time, they changed their behavior in a way that no one expected. Instead of mentoring, helping, or informally supporting female colleagues, men began competing with them ruthlessly. They stopped opening doors socially and professionally. They focused purely on output, value, and performance, and they chose candidates who maximized efficiency and minimized risk. No mentorship, no guidance, no social cushioning, just competition. And out in highly competitive environments, that shift alone dramatically altered outcomes. When women criticized television dramas and comedy shows for portraying playful or edgy interactions between men and women, men again complied. They supported removing those interactions entirely in the name of equality. The result was predictable. These shows became bland, humorless, and unappealing, especially to men who were already drifting away. Men stopped watching altogether, leaving behind entertainment ecosystems almost entirely consumed by women, stripped of the very dynamics that once made them popular. This pattern repeated itself everywhere. When women complained about behaviors like manspreading on public transport, men agreed that taking up excess space was unacceptable. But they also insisted that the same standard be applied universally. Bags on seats became violations. Extra space of any kind became reportable. Men adjusted their schedules to avoid shared commuting times entirely, leaving earlier or later so they could travel comfortably alone. When forced to travel during peak hours, they complied strictly, standing silently and reporting violations rather than engaging socially. The result was not harmony, but separation. Over time, these responses produced a society where men and women increasingly occupy the same physical spaces but live in entirely different social realities. Men stopped talking to women, they stopped approaching them, they stopped helping them in public, at work, or in daily life. They maintained distance not out of hatred, but out of self preservation. Every complaint was met with agreement and compliance, but that compliance hollowed out the social fabric that once connected the sexes. What makes this dynamic so powerful is that it does not require coordination or leadership. It spreads naturally as men observe outcomes and adjust behavior accordingly. When men see that any interaction carries risk and no upside, disengagement becomes rational. When they see that society offers them little incentive to invest in long term relationships or families, they stop doing so. And when enough men reach that conclusion, the consequences become systemic. This is why the popular narrative around movements like the 4B movement misses the mark. While it is true that some women in South Korea publicly rejected dating, marriage, and motherhood, this movement did not create the birth rate collapse. It responded to it. The real driver was male withdrawal that had already begun years earlier. When men stopped pursuing women, stopped forming households, and stopped seeing family as a viable path, fertility rates collapsed regardless of what women said they wanted. The irony is that feminist groups themselves often oppose some of the policies men supported, such as strict limits on romantic pursuit, because those policies eliminated the leverage women once had in dating. When 3 attempts became the legal maximum, prolonged games disappeared. Men simply walked away after the first or second rejection or never approached at all. What was framed as protection quickly became isolation. This pattern is not confined to South Korea. It is emerging globally with different expressions but similar outcomes. In the United States, projections suggest that by 2030, nearly half of women between the ages of 25 and 44 will be single and childless. When single mothers are included, that number rises dramatically. And again, this is not primarily because women are opting out, it is because men are no longer opting in. Most young men today are single, while most young women are not. At first glance, that sounds contradictory until you realize that many women are sharing the same small pool of men. A shrinking minority of men are dating multiple women simultaneously, while the majority of men are excluded entirely. Over time, even that small pool shrinks as high value men opt out as well, choosing solitude, travel, or alternative lifestyles over the complexities and risks of modern dating. As men disengage from relationships, they are also disengaging from consumer driven social spaces. Restaurants suffer because men historically paid for the majority of dates and meals. Upscale dining declines when men stop taking women out. Gyms collapse when men abandon mixed gender spaces due to harassment concerns and build private home gyms or join male only facilities. Bars and clubs empty out as men avoid them entirely, leaving behind rooms full of women sitting alone with no one buying drinks. Because women do not fund nightlife economies, men do. These economic shifts ripple outward. Men account for the majority of tax revenue in many countries, while women account for the majority of consumer spending. When men work fewer hours, pay less in taxes, and consume less, states lose funding. Programs designed to support women struggle as revenue dries up. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Governments that once promised provision cannot deliver it, and suddenly the absence of men becomes a fiscal crisis as much as a social one. Online, the same separation is accelerating. Men are building parallel ecosystems designed for men, by men, and increasingly excluding women entirely. Media spaces, educational channels, financial communities, gaming cultures, and technical forums are all shifting toward male centered narratives. Men are finding community, validation, and knowledge outside of traditional institutions, and they are no longer seeking female approval within those spaces. At the same time, technological shifts are accelerating male disengagement further. Artificial intelligence is rapidly replacing roles in industries that once relied heavily on female participation, particularly in digital entertainment and adult content. Men are increasingly forming emotional bonds with AI companions, not because they cannot interact with women, but because these systems offer companionship without risk, accusation, or obligation. This trend is still early, but it is growing fast. Men are also pivoting economically. As traditional employment becomes unstable, men are gravitating toward decentralized work, crypto based systems, skill bartering, and survival oriented communities. These spaces value autonomy, competence, and contribution, and they often exclude anyone who cannot provide tangible value. Women, accustomed to consumer roles and institutional protection, are finding themselves shut out. Even practical skills have become points of separation. Tradesmen charge women more because they see them as higher risk clients. Men barter skills among themselves at lower cost, reinforcing male networks while isolating women further. This is not coordinated punishment. It is market behavior shaped by trust and familiarity. When men want companionship or romance, many are simply leaving. They travel to countries where social dynamics are less adversarial and where men are still valued as providers and partners. Lower costs of living amplify their economic power, allowing them to live comfortably while opting out of Western social systems entirely. Meanwhile, women in developed nations are left competing over fewer and fewer men within shrinking economies. What makes this moment so critical is that it is self reinforcing. As men leave shared spaces, those spaces deteriorate. As they deteriorate, more men leave. And as more men leave, the idea of rebuilding becomes less realistic. South Korea may be the first country to face the full consequences of this cycle, but it will not be the last. This is not a story about hatred or revenge. It is a story about incentives, risk, and rational choice. Men were told to go away, to be quiet, to comply, and to accept blame. They did exactly that. And now society is discovering what happens when the group that once carried much of the social, economic, and relational burden decides that the cost is no longer worth it. As this disengagement deepens, what becomes impossible to ignore is how quietly it is happening. There are no dramatic announcements from men saying they are done with society, no coordinated movements marching through city streets, no centralized ideology with a manifesto. Instead, this shift moves like groundwater beneath the surface, invisible until entire structures begin to crack. Men simply stop participating one choice at a time. They decline invitations, they stop initiating conversations, they choose smaller apartments, fewer possessions, simpler lives. They reduce their ambitions, not because they lack ability, but because ambition no longer serves a shared future they believe in. And when enough individuals make those same small decisions, the cumulative effect becomes seismic. In South Korea, this pattern has reached a level of intensity that policymakers openly admit they do not know how to reverse. Financial incentives for childbirth have failed, housing subsidies have failed, extended parental leave has failed, campaigns encouraging romance and family formation have failed. None of these policies address the core issue, which is that men no longer see women, marriage, or children as a net positive outcome in their lives. When the emotional, legal, social, and economic risks outweigh the perceived benefits, rational actors disengage. This is not ideology, it is cost benefit analysis applied at scale. What makes this especially destabilizing is that men are not replacing traditional relationships with alternative family structures. They are replacing them with nothing. Solitude, once treated as a temporary phase, is becoming a permanent lifestyle. Men are discovering that they can live with fewer obligations, fewer conflicts, and fewer expectations placed upon them. They can invest in themselves, their hobbies, their health, and their financial security without being constantly evaluated or criticized. For many, this produces a sense of calm they have never experienced before. And once peace becomes the baseline, chaos becomes unacceptable. This is why attempts to shame men back into participation have failed so spectacularly. Labeling men as irresponsible, immature, or selfish does not work when men no longer seek approval from the institutions or voices doing the labeling. Moral pressure only functions when the target still values the moral authority applying it. That authority has eroded. Men no longer believe that society is acting in good faith toward them, and without trust, persuasion collapses. The workplace offers one of the clearest examples of how this plays out. In environments where men once took informal responsibility for mentoring younger employees, especially women, that behavior has largely vanished. Men have learned that helping can be reinterpreted as favoritism or misconduct, and that neutrality is safer than generosity. The result is a colder, more transactional professional culture. Performance replaces potential, output replaces effort, relationships are minimized. This environment rewards those who can compete aggressively and punishes those who rely on social support, which disproportionately affects women. This shift also reshapes education and career choices. Men increasingly avoid professions that expose them to regulatory risk, public scrutiny, or emotional labor. They gravitate toward technical skills, remote work, and fields where performance is measurable and interactions are limited. Trades, engineering, cybersecurity, logistics, and decentralized finance attract men not just because of income, but because of autonomy. These fields allow men to work, earn, and disengage without constant social negotiation. Women, meanwhile, remain clustered in sectors that depend heavily on social interaction, institutional backing, and consumer spending. As those sectors contract under economic pressure, women experience greater instability. The safety nets they were encouraged to rely on weaken as tax revenues fall. The promise that the state would replace male provision begins to sound hollow. And yet, even at this stage, many still fail to connect the dots between male withdrawal and institutional collapse. The dating market illustrates this disconnect vividly. Dating apps present the illusion of endless choice, particularly for women, but beneath that surface lies extreme concentration. A small percentage of men receive the majority of attention, while the rest are effectively invisible. Over time, this dynamic burns out both sides. Average men disengage entirely, while high demand men tire them of shallow interactions and exit as well. The result is a market with fewer participants, lower trust, and rising frustration. As men leave dating entirely, they take with them more than companionship. They remove investment, planning, and future orientation. Relationships are not just emotional bonds, they are economic engines. They drive housing demand, consumption, career advancement, and long term planning. When men stop seeing themselves as future husbands or fathers, they stop making decisions that assume stability. This affects everything from real estate markets to retirement systems. In South Korea, entire apartment complexes now sit partially empty because young men do not want family sized housing. Small studios and minimalist living spaces dominate new construction. Urban planning shifts towards single occupancy units. This further discourages family formation, creating a feedback loop that reinforces the original disengagement. Once infrastructure adapts to solitude, reversing course becomes even harder. Culturally, the consequences are just as profound. Shared rituals around dating, marriage, and family lose relevance. Holidays that once centered around couples and children become reminders of absence. Media narratives struggle to resonate because the audience they were designed for no longer exists. Men consume different content, often practical, analytical, or escapist. Women consume content that increasingly reflects anxiety, frustration, and nostalgia for a social contract that no longer functions. The rise of male only digital spaces accelerates this divergence. Men discuss finances, health, philosophy, technology, and strategy without filtering their language or perspectives. These spaces reward clarity and results rather than emotional validation. Over time, they produce a worldview centered on self sufficiency and risk management. Women are not excluded through hostility, but through irrelevance. If someone cannot contribute to the shared goals of the group, they are simply ignored. Artificial intelligence amplifies this trend by offering men tools that replace aspects of human interaction without the associated risks. AI does not accuse, demand, or shame. It does not impose legal obligations or emotional labor. For men who have experienced years of social hostility, this is not a novelty, it is a relief. While these systems cannot replace human relationships entirely, they reduce the pressure to seek them at all. At the same time, men are increasingly mobile. Remote work and digital income streams allow them to detach from national economies. Loyalty to a country weakens when that country offers no stake in its future. Men who do not plan to marry or raise children have little reason to care about long term demographic decline. They focus on their own horizon, not the nation's. This is how societies unravel quietly, not through revolt, but through indifference. Governments respond with messaging campaigns urging unity, empathy, and shared responsibility, but these messages ring hollow to men who feel they were never treated as partners in the social project. Responsibility without reciprocity feels like exploitation. Unity without trust feels like manipulation. Until those foundational issues are addressed, no amount of rhetoric will bring men back. What makes the situation especially stark is that men are not suffering in the way many expected. Surveys increasingly show that single men report higher levels of peace and satisfaction than married or dating men in similar economic conditions. They sleep better, they save more, they report less stress. This does not mean they are euphoric, but it does mean they are stable. And stability is addictive. Women, by contrast, face increasing instability as the systems that once buffered them weaken. Rising costs, declining social cohesion, and shrinking support networks expose vulnerabilities that were previously masked. As more women compete for fewer men, resentment grows, but resentment does not rebuild trust. It deepens the divide. This is why the South Korean case matters so much. It is not an anomaly. It is a warning. It shows what happens when a society treats one half of its population as disposable until that half decides to dispose of the society in return, not through destruction, but through absence. And absence is harder to fight than the opposition because you cannot argue with someone who is no longer there. As absence becomes normalized, it reshapes expectations in ways that are difficult to reverse. When boys grow up watching older men live quietly alone, unbothered, and largely invisible to society, that lifestyle stops looking like failure and starts looking like foresight. Younger men do not need to be convinced to walk away. They simply observe outcomes and adjust. They see who is stressed, who is calm, who is financially stable, and who is constantly navigating conflict. Lessons are absorbed without instruction. Culture transmits itself through example far more than through ideology. In South Korea, this generational transmission is already visible. Young men entering adulthood are delaying milestones not out of confusion, but out of clarity. They understand the legal environment, the social expectations, and the potential consequences of intimate relationships. They are not naive and they are not rebellious. They are cautious, they are strategic. They ask questions that previous generations never had to ask, such as what legal protections exist for them, how disputes are resolved, and what happens if things go wrong. When the answers are vague, dismissive, or hostile, disengagement feels like the only rational choice. The education system reinforces this mindset unintentionally. Boys who fall behind academically receive little targeted support, while resources are increasingly directed toward female advancement initiatives. This creates a quiet resentment, not because men oppose women succeeding, but because they recognize the asymmetry. When effort does not translate into encouragement or reward, motivation erodes. Men learn early that they are expected to adapt alone. This sense of isolation follows men into adulthood. Social networks shrink as mixed gender friendships become fraught with suspicion and risk. A simple misunderstanding can escalate into reputational damage, workplace consequences, or legal trouble. Men respond by narrowing their circles to trusted peers or withdrawing entirely. Emotional expression is redirected inward or into male only spaces where it is less likely to be weaponized. Over time, this creates a society where men and women inhabit parallel worlds that rarely intersect meaningfully. They may work in the same buildings, ride the same trains, and live in the same cities, but they do not share narratives. Each group tells itself a different story about why things are failing. Women often frame the crisis as abandonment, immaturity, or selfishness. Men frame it as self defense. Without shared language, dialogue collapses. Media coverage exacerbates this divide by focusing on surface level explanations. Articles highlight declining marriage rates without addressing male incentives. Panels discuss work life balance without acknowledging relational risk. Solutions are framed around encouraging women to have children rather than understanding why men no longer want families. The absence of male perspective is not accidental. It reflects a broader unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths. One of those truths is that modern societies were built on an assumption of male sacrifice. Men were expected to work longer hours, take on dangerous jobs, and prioritize provision over personal fulfillment. In return, they were offered social respect, family stability, and a clear role. As those rewards diminished, the expectation of sacrifice remained. When that imbalance became too great, men recalibrated. This recalibration does not look dramatic from the outside. Men still go to work, they still pay bills, they still exist, but they no longer overextend themselves for institutions or relationships that do not reciprocate. They downshift. They choose roles that minimize stress and maximize control. They decline leadership positions that demand emotional labor without authority. They avoid industries that rely on guilt or obligation to extract performance. As men reduce their participation, the load shifts elsewhere. Women, institutions, and the state attempt to compensate, but none can fully replace what was lost. The result is strain. Workplaces struggle with retention. Governments face budget shortfalls. Social services become overwhelmed. Each system reacts independently, unaware that they are responding to the same root cause. The irony is that many of these systems continue to frame men as privileged, even as their participation declines. Privilege implies leverage, but disengaged men wield very little leverage because they are no longer invested. They cannot be pressured with promises they do not want or threats they do not fear. This disconnect between perception and reality leads to ineffective policy and further alienation. In South Korea, public discourse increasingly acknowledges the crisis, but solutions remain superficial. Campaigns encourage men to date again, to be more open, to reconnect, yet they do not address why men left in the first place. Trust, once broken, cannot be restored through slogans. It requires structural change, accountability, and genuine reciprocity. Without that, appeals fall flat. Meanwhile, men continue building alternative lives. They invest in digital skills that allow remote income. They participate in decentralized markets where rules are transparent and enforcement is algorithmic rather than subjective. They learn to cook, repair, and maintain their own spaces. Independence becomes a point of pride rather than a temporary compromise. Women observe this shift with growing anxiety. As peer groups age without partners or children, the future looks uncertain. Support networks thin out. Economic pressure mounts. The expectation that things will eventually work out feels less convincing. Some women attempt to reframe independence as empowerment, but empowerment without stability is exhausting. Autonomy without support becomes isolation. Attempts to shame men back into relationships often backfire. Accusations of cowardice or selfishness reinforce male narratives of hostility. Men who have found peace in solitude are unlikely to trade it for conflict. Emotional blackmail fails when the target has emotionally detached. The power dynamic has already shifted. The dating landscape reflects this stalemate. Women report fewer approaches and less initiative from men. Men report relief. Both sides feel misunderstood. Algorithms amplify the divide by rewarding extreme perspectives and reinforcing existing beliefs. Nuance disappears. Trust erodes further. What is rarely acknowledged is that men did not gain from this outcome in the way critics assume. They did not seize power or dominate society, they simply withdrew. The benefits they experience are relative, not absolute. Peace replaces chaos, stability replaces uncertainty. But these gains exist alongside a broader societal decline that affects everyone. This is the paradox of disengagement. It protects the individual while harming the collective. Men who opt out do so rationally, but the aggregate effect undermines systems that rely on participation. Birth rates fall, economies contract, cultural continuity phrase. No single man causes this, yet all contribute by stepping back. South Korea stands at the forefront of this transformation because it combined intense social pressure with rapid modernization. Traditional expectations collided with modern ideology without a stable transition. Men absorbed the shock and adjusted. Other countries are following at different speeds, but the direction is consistent. The question is not whether this trend will continue, but whether societies can adapt without coercion. Forcing participation through policy risks, backlash, and further withdrawal. Ignoring the issue guarantees decline. The only viable path forward requires rebuilding trust between men and society and between men and women on new terms. That would require acknowledging male grievances without dismissing them as resentment. It would require redefining equality as mutual obligation rather than unilateral expectation. It would require creating legal and social environments where cooperation feels safe again. None of these steps are easy, and none can be achieved quickly. Until then, men will continue to choose the path of least resistance. They will live smaller, quieter lives, focused on self preservation. They will watch society struggle without intervening, not out of malice, but out of exhaustion. And as this pattern spreads, more countries will begin to resemble South Korea, not culturally, but structurally. Aging populations, shrinking workforces, isolated individuals, fragmented communities. The warning signs are already visible for those willing to look. Before we move further, it is important to pause and reflect on what this really means. This is not about winning or losing between genders. It is about the unraveling of shared purpose. When half the population no longer believes in the future, that future collapses quietly. And once quiet collapse becomes normal, rebuilding requires more than incentives. It requires trust. As trust erodes, what replaces it is not chaos, but caution. Caution becomes Sinbad's the default posture for men navigating every interaction, every decision, every long term plan. Where previous generations assumed continuity, modern men assume volatility. They assume that rules will change, that narratives will shift, and that yesterday's expectations may become tomorrow's liabilities. In such an environment, flexibility matters more than commitment, and optionality matters more than loyalty. This mindset is not cynical, it is adaptive. In South Korea, this adaptation is visible in how men structure their lives around reversibility. They avoid decisions that cannot be undone easily. Marriage is difficult to reverse. Children are impossible to reverse. Shared property ties one's future to another person's behavior. Men increasingly avoid all three. Instead, they focus on modular lives where relationships, work, and location can be changed without catastrophic loss. Short term leases replace mortgages. Freelance income replaces corporate ladders. Digital assets replace physical accumulation. The future is treated as uncertain terrain rather than a destination to build toward. This shift fundamentally alters how men perceive time. Long term planning used to revolve around family milestones, career progression, and legacy. Now it revolves around resilience. Can I survive downturns? Can I adapt to disruption? Can I remain independent if institutions fail me? These questions dominate male decision making in a way that would have seemed extreme just decades ago. Yet, from the male perspective, they are simply realistic. The state struggles to respond because its tools are blunt and outdated. Governments are built to incentivize behavior through benefits, penalties, and messaging. But incentives lose power when people do not want what is being offered, and penalties lose power when people are willing to disengage. Encouraging childbirth with cash bonuses does not persuade men who see parenthood as a long term liability. Offering social praise does not motivate men who no longer value public approval. Threatening taxes or restrictions only accelerates exit behavior through offshoring, remote work, or reduced participation. This creates a growing gap between policy intention and lived reality. Officials speak in the language of national survival, while men operate in the language of personal survival. Those frameworks rarely align. National survival assumes sacrifice. Personal survival assumes boundaries. When sacrifice is no longer reciprocated, boundaries harden. Women, meanwhile, are caught between competing narratives. On one hand, they are encouraged to be independent, career focused, and self sufficient. On the other hand, they are told that falling birth rates are a crisis and that families matter. These messages conflict. Independence discourages reliance. Family formation requires reliance. The contradiction is rarely resolved honestly. leaving women oscillating between roles without stable footing in either. As male disengagement continues, women increasingly experience a shortage of male labor in informal but essential roles. Men once handled a disproportionate share of physical tasks, maintenance, logistics, and emergency response. As men retreat into private spaces or male only networks, these services become scarcer or more expensive. This is not because men refuse outright, but because their time and effort are no longer freely offered. Everything becomes transactional. This transactional shift extends to emotional labor as well. Men once absorbed emotional stress within families and relationships, acting as buffers during conflict or crisis. As those relationships disappear, women find fewer outlets for emotional regulation. Friend groups attempt to compensate, but peer support lacks the stability and commitment of long term partnership. The result is rising anxiety, burnout, and resentment. The feedback loop tightens. As women express frustration publicly, men feel validated in their withdrawal. As men withdraw further, women experience greater scarcity and frustration. Each side interprets the other's behavior through its own lens, reinforcing existing beliefs. Dialogue becomes impossible because neither side trusts the other's intentions. The role of media in this cycle cannot be overstated. Sensational headlines and polarized narratives amplify conflict because conflict drives engagement. Nuanced discussion receives less attention. Stories that portray men as villains or women as victims generate clicks, but they also deepen mistrust. Over time, audiences self select into echo chambers that confirm their worldview. Exposure to opposing perspectives decreases, making compromise harder. In South Korea, this polarization has reached a point where even discussing gender dynamics openly carries risk. Men avoid speaking candidly in mixed settings. Women distrust male motives. Public discourse becomes sanitized and performative, disconnected from private reality. The real conversations happen elsewhere, behind closed doors or in anonymous spaces. This fragmentation extends into politics. Voting patterns diverge sharply along gender lines. Men gravitate toward policies emphasizing security, autonomy, and reduced obligation. Women gravitate toward policies emphasizing protection, redistribution, and social support. Neither side feels represented fully, and coalitions become unstable. Governance becomes reactive rather than strategic. Economic consequences follow inevitably. Declining birth rates reduce the future workforce, increasing pressure on social security systems. Aging populations require more care with fewer providers. Productivity slows as innovation suffers from risk aversion and talent shortages. Immigration is often proposed as a solution, but integration challenges and cultural friction complicate outcomes. Importing people does not automatically import trust. Corporations adapt by automating wherever possible, reducing dependence on human labor. This further erodes traditional employment paths, particularly in service sectors. Men adapt more easily to automation due to earlier pivots toward technical and decentralized skills. Women, more concentrated in human facing roles, face displacement without clear alternatives. The gap widens. At the personal level, men increasingly frame their lives around peace. Peace becomes the metric by which decisions are judged. Does this relationship bring peace? Does this job bring peace? Does this environment bring peace? If the answer is no, men leave. This is not laziness, it is prioritization shaped by experience. Critics argue that this mindset is selfish, that society cannot function if everyone prioritizes personal comfort. That critique assumes society has upheld its end of the bargain. From the male perspective, it has not. When responsibility is demanded without protection, disengagement becomes self defense rather than indulgence. South Korea illustrates how quickly this mindset can become dominant once a tipping point is reached. Early adopters of disengagement were mocked or dismissed. Later adopters observed outcomes and followed quietly. Eventually, disengagement became normalized. At that stage, reversing course requires extraordinary effort and trust rebuilding at a scale few institutions can manage. What makes this particularly challenging is that men are not organizing around a shared identity or movement. There is no leader to negotiate with, no platform to address, no demands to meet. Disengagement is decentralized and individualized. Each man acts independently, yet the aggregate effect is cohesive. This makes traditional negotiation impossible. The same dynamic appears in other countries at earlier stages. Japan faces similar demographic collapse driven by male withdrawal. China shows early signs as economic pressure and social expectations collide. Western nations exhibit rising male solitude and declining family formation. Cultural differences affect expression, but the underlying logic remains consistent. The long term implications are profound. Societies built on interdependence struggle when independence becomes the dominant value. Shared institutions weaken, community erodes, loneliness increases even as conflict decreases. People coexist rather than connect. Some argue that this is simply a transitional phase, that new norms will emerge and balance will be restored. That is possible. But transitions are rarely painless and outcomes are not guaranteed. Without deliberate effort to rebuild trust, transitions can ossify into permanent decline. The uncomfortable reality is that men hold disproportionate leverage over whether societies reproduce, stabilize, and sustain themselves, not because men are superior, but because their participation historically underpinned those processes. When that participation becomes optional, the system loses its foundation. Rebuilding that foundation requires more than appealing to duty. It requires creating conditions where men believe participation is safe, valued, and worthwhile. That means legal clarity, cultural respect, and mutual accountability. It means acknowledging harm rather than dismissing it. It means redefining equality as partnership rather than opposition. Until those changes occur, the path of least resistance will continue to dominate male decision making. Men will choose solitude over scrutiny, autonomy over obligation, peace over participation. And as more men make that choice, societies will continue to age, shrink, and fragment, not with a bang, but with a quiet absence that no policy can easily replace. This is the lesson unfolding in South Korea. It is not about ideology, it is about incentives, trust, and the human response to sustained pressure. Ignore it, and the same patterns will repeat elsewhere. As societies age into this absence, something subtle but critical shifts in how responsibility is perceived. Responsibility no longer feels shared, it feels imposed. And when responsibility feels imposed rather than chosen, compliance becomes minimal. Men do what is necessary to avoid penalty, not what is needed to sustain the whole. This distinction matters because modern systems rely on discretionary effort. They rely on people doing more than the bare minimum. When that extra effort disappears, systems hollow out from the inside. In South Korea, this is evident in work culture changes that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Men increasingly refuse overtime, decline promotions, and avoid leadership tracks that require visibility and accountability without corresponding authority or protection. They are not lazy, they are selective. They understand that being indispensable also makes them expendable. Being visible also makes them vulnerable. The safest position becomes one of competence without prominence. This recalibration has cascading effects. Younger employees lack mentors, institutional knowledge erodes, continuity suffers, organizations become brittle, dependent on processes rather than people. When disruptions occur, recovery slows. These are not dramatic failures, but cumulative inefficiencies that compound over time. At the same time, men's relationship with money is changing. Without families to support or social expectations to meet, consumption declines. Men prioritize savings, investments, and liquidity. They spend on tools, education, and experiences that enhance autonomy rather than status. This undermines consumer driven growth models that assume constant demand fueled by household formation. Entire industries built around weddings, childcare, home furnishing, and lifestyle branding contract sharply. Women, still encouraged to consume as a form of empowerment and self expression, find themselves carrying financial burdens alone. Debt rises, stress increases. The promise that independence would feel liberating collides with the reality that independence without shared provision is exhausting. This tension is rarely addressed honestly because it challenges deeply embedded narratives. As these pressures mount, a cultural nostalgia emerges. Media romanticizes past eras of romance, partnership, and community without grappling with why those structures existed in the first place. People yearn for outcomes without acknowledging inputs. They want connection without risk, stability without sacrifice, and support without obligation. But systems do not work that way. Men observe this nostalgia with detachment. They remember the costs of those older structures as well as the benefits. They remember expectations placed on them without commensurate appreciation. When asked to return to that model without meaningful change, they decline. This refusal is often misinterpreted as bitterness. In reality, it is a boundary. Boundaries form when trust is broken repeatedly. And trust, once broken at scale, is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. Apologies without action do nothing. Promises without enforcement ring hollow. Men have learned to judge systems by outcomes rather than intentions. The legal environment plays a decisive role here. Ambiguity in rules governing relationships, employment, and conflict resolution creates fear. Fear discourages engagement. When consequences are unclear or disproportionate, avoidance becomes rational. Men are not asking for special treatment, they are asking for predictability. Without it, they step back. This legal uncertainty also discourages emotional investment. Emotional investment creates leverage. Leverage creates vulnerability. In a climate where narratives can shift overnight, men protect themselves by limiting exposure. Emotional neutrality becomes a survival strategy. This is why so many men report feeling calmer, but also more detached. Peace is achieved at the cost of connection. Women, encountering this detachment, often interpret it as disinterest or cruelty. They respond with frustration, demands, or withdrawal of their own. Each reaction confirms the other's fears. The spiral tightens. Education systems struggle to adapt to this reality. Young men disengage academically when they do not see clear pathways that reward effort. When educational attainment does not translate into stability or respect, motivation collapses. This contributes to widening gender gaps in education that policymakers frame as male underperformance without addressing systemic incentives. As more men bypass traditional education, alternative learning pathways gain traction. Online courses, apprenticeships, and self directed skill acquisition flourish. These paths favor autonomy and practical outcomes. They also bypass institutional messaging entirely. Men learn what they need when they need it without ideological framing. This further weakens the influence of traditional cultural institutions. The social consequences extend into health and well being. Men invest more in physical fitness, nutrition, and mental resilience. Gyms shift toward private or male only formats. Outdoor activities and solitary hobbies gain popularity. Men learn to regulate stress internally rather than through relational support. This increases resilience but reduces interdependence. Interdependence, once the glue of society, becomes optional. Optionality undermines obligation. Obligation undermines freedom. Freedom becomes the highest value. This hierarchy of values reshapes everything from architecture to technology to governance. Though urban environments adapt by catering to single occupants, smaller living spaces, automated services, and delivery based economies proliferate. Social spaces shrink or become niche. Community becomes segmented. Shared experiences diminish. Women navigate this landscape differently. Many still desire partnership, family, and shared meaning, but find fewer willing participants. Some adjust expectations downward. Others pursue fulfillment through work, activism, or consumption. None of these fully replace relational stability. The result is widespread dissatisfaction masked by curated narratives of empowerment. The state attempts to intervene through policy, but policy cannot manufacture trust. Trust emerges from consistent, fair treatment over time. It cannot be legislated into existence. When men see repeated cycles of blame followed by demands for participation, skepticism hardens into refusal. In South Korea, officials increasingly speak openly about the risk of national decline. Yet their solutions focus on outcomes rather than causes. They want more births without addressing why men do not want families. They want more engagement without addressing why men withdrew. This inversion guarantees failure. Other nations watch these developments with concern but little urgency. They assume cultural differences will protect them. They underestimate the universality of incentive driven behavior. When conditions align, outcomes converge regardless of culture. The most unsettling aspect of this transformation is its quietness. There is no clear moment when things fall apart. There is no single decision or event. Life simply becomes thinner. Fewer connections, fewer commitments, fewer shared futures. Decline feels abstract until it becomes personal. By the time consequences are undeniable, options are limited. Rebuilding trust requires admitting fault, redistributing responsibility, and redesigning systems around mutual benefit. These steps challenge entrenched interests and ideologies. Resistance is inevitable. Men, watching from the margins, are unlikely to re enter until they see sustained change, not symbolic gestures, not rhetoric, structural reform, clear rules, balanced accountability, genuine respect. Without these, disengagement remains the rational choice. This is not a call to return to the past. The past had flaws that cannot be ignored. It is a call to recognize that any functional future requires cooperation. Cooperation requires trust. Trust requires fairness. Fairness requires humility from institutions that have grown accustomed to moral authority without accountability. South Korea's experience offers a rare glimpse into a possible future elsewhere. It shows what happens when one half of society quietly opts out. It shows how quickly systems dependent on goodwill unravel. It shows that participation cannot be coerced indefinitely. Whether societies learn from this example remains uncertain. What is clear is that ignoring it will not make it go away. The forces driving male disengagement are structural, not emotional. They will persist until addressed or until collapse forces adaptation. Men will continue choosing paths that preserve their peace and autonomy. Women will continue grappling with the consequences of scarcity and instability. Institutions will struggle to reconcile ideals with outcomes. The question is not who is right or wrong. The question is whether societies can rebuild a shared vision compelling enough to bring people back together voluntarily. Until then, the quiet withdrawal continues. As this quiet withdrawal reaches its later stages, the most striking change is not what men are doing, but what they are no longer willing to tolerate. Tolerance itself has become selective. Men no longer absorb instability for the sake of appearances. They no longer endure environments that frame them as problems to be managed rather than contributors to be valued. This is not rebellion, it is filtration. Men filter out people, institutions, and expectations that do not offer clear mutual benefit. What remains is a leaner life with fewer attachments but far fewer points of friction. In South Korea, this filtration process has reshaped daily routines in ways that seem mundane until viewed collectively. Men shop less, they socialize less, they commute at off hours, they choose entertainment that does not require social negotiation. They structure their days around efficiency and calm. Each decision is small. Together, they form a lifestyle optimized for low exposure. And once a man experiences the reduction in stress that comes from this approach, returning to a high exposure lifestyle feels irrational. This is why appeals to nostalgia fail. You cannot persuade someone to return to a system they associate with constant risk by reminding them of its theoretical benefits. Memories are filtered through experience. For many men, the memory of participation is not warmth or belonging, it is scrutiny, accusation, and instability. Nostalgia without reform feels like gaslighting. The deeper issue is that modern societies underestimated how much of their stability relied on voluntary male overcontribution. Men historically did more than was strictly required, not because they were forced, but because they believed their effort mattered and would be reciprocated. Once that belief eroded, overcontribution vanished. What remains is contractual participation at best. This distinction explains why many institutions feel hollow. They still function on paper, but the spirit that once animated them is gone. Processes replace judgment, rules replace relationships, metrics replace meaning. These substitutions keep systems running temporarily, but they cannot sustain them indefinitely. Human systems require trust to thrive. As trust declines, risk aversion increases, innovation slows, creativity narrows, people stick to safe choices. In South Korea, this manifests in conservative career decisions, delayed entrepreneurship, and reluctance to invest in long term projects. Why take risks when the future feels hostile or uncertain? Why build something you may not benefit from? Women experience this stagnation differently. Many feel trapped between expectations to be independent and desires for connection. They are told they do not need men, yet they feel the absence of men everywhere, in dating, in workplaces, in public spaces. The contradiction creates cognitive strain. Some respond by doubling down on independence, others by seeking security through institutions that are themselves weakening. As institutions weaken, competition intensifies. Scarcity breeds conflict. Women compete with each other for access to a shrinking pool of men. Men compete with each other for autonomy rather than status. The social fabric stretches thin. Cooperation becomes rare. Transaction replaces trust. The global implications of this shift are profound. Countries that once relied on population growth and household formation to fuel economic expansion face structural contraction. Aging populations strain healthcare systems. Pension schemes wobble. Immigration is proposed as a fix, but without social cohesion, integration falters. Newcomers inherit the same mistrust that drove disengagement in the first place. Technology accelerates every stage of this process. Automation reduces the need for human labor. Digital platforms replace in person interaction. Virtual spaces offer connection without obligation. For men already inclined toward withdrawal, technology makes disengagement easier and more rewarding. For women seeking connection, technology often amplifies competition and comparison rather than intimacy. The irony is that both men and women end up lonelier, but for different reasons. Men choose loneliness as a shield. Women experience loneliness as a loss. The same outcome is interpreted through opposite emotional frames. This divergence makes empathy difficult. Attempts to force reconciliation through policy or social pressure fail because they do not address underlying incentives. You cannot legislate desire. You cannot mandate trust. You cannot shame people into vulnerability. These things must be earned through consistent, fair treatment over time. South Korea illustrates the end state of ignoring these principles. A society where men and women coexist physically but not socially, where births are rare, where futures are uncertain, where institutions plead for participation without offering protection. It is not dystopian, it is quiet. And that quietness is precisely what makes it dangerous. Yet, this story does not have to end in collapse. Decline is not destiny. The same forces that drive disengagement can be redirected if conditions change. Men are not inherently opposed to cooperation, they are opposed to exploitation. When cooperation feels safe and fair, men participate willingly. History proves this repeatedly. Rebuilding that sense of safety requires difficult conversations and structural change. It requires acknowledging male vulnerability without ridicule. It requires legal clarity that protects all parties equally. It requires cultural narratives that value contribution over blame. It requires institutions to earn trust rather than assume it. For women, it requires confronting uncomfortable truth about dependency and consumption. Independence is empowering only when paired with sustainability. A society cannot function if large segments are consumers without producers. Partnership requires reciprocity, not ideology. For governments, it requires humility, admitting that previous policies failed, accepting that incentives matter more than messaging, designing systems that reward cooperation rather than punish participation. This is politically risky, but inaction is riskier. The alternative is a future defined by fragmentation, smaller households, smaller ambitions, smaller communities, people living parallel lives with minimal overlap. Stability achieved through isolation rather than connection. Survival without meaning. Men will continue to adapt. They always do. They will find ways to live comfortably within whatever constraints exist. They will build parallel systems. They will trade, invest, and survive. The question is whether societies will adapt as well, or whether they will continue demanding participation from people who no longer believe in the project. South Korea stands as a mirror, not a moral lesson, but a practical one. It shows what happens when incentives align against engagement. It shows how quickly participation can evaporate when trust disappears. It shows that social collapse does not require catastrophe. It only requires indifference. As this discussion comes to a close, it is worth asking a simple question. What kind of future do people actually want? One built on mutual suspicion and minimal obligation, or one rebuilt on fairness and shared responsibility? That choice still exists, but time is running out. Before we close, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed in this video? Do you agree with the direction things appear to be moving? Are you seeing similar patterns in your own country, your workplace, or your personal life? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because these conversations matter and they help bring clarity to issues that are often ignored or misunderstood. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.